Deep Magic, Chapter 2, Deck Construction.
Next on Eternal Durdles. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, welcome to Boomer Magic Book Club.
Bro, I love Boomer Magic Book Club, though. Actually, I'm ready to get educated.
Yeah, let's start off with the basics. This is the second video, so if you haven't seen the first video, it's totally not necessary to watch the first video, but I think it'll do you a lot of good. That's recapping the basics. We'll have a link probably right here. There'll also be a playlist for it and everything, so you can watch the whole thing. If you want to check out the book, you can check out, there is a Amazon link in the description below. Like I said, we're still trying to reach out to the writers of the book, that is George H. Baxter and Charles Wolfe, to try and get permission to do an audiobook, possibly a, get a PDF going or something like that of the book. If you really need help finding the book, you can always join our Discord, and we'll set you up. We'll figure out something for you. So anyhow, without any further ado, Phil, Chapter 2, Deck Construction.
First off, it's a very easy read. So
yeah, this is like 8 pages.
Some of the stuff is kind of you can tell some of the things are dated. Yeah. I mean, I think we mentioned that last time. Like some of the wording that they use is dated and stuff, but for the most part, a lot of the applications still apply. And one thing that they say in different words is finding the legacy power level thing to do.
Definitely.
The initial go if you want to head right into the initial thing that they talk about is what is the goal of the deck.
Well, I think before we go too far into that, I wanted to bring up the very first thought to me is this is basically the thesis of our show. The very first two sentences. The process of deck construction is the fundamental skill in playing Magic. In order to be an effective Magic player, you must be able to design and develop effective decks. I think that there is no two sentences that more clearly state our intentions with this project and with the channel in and of itself.
Yeah, and isolating that in varieties of different metas. I mean, the way that they talk about deck construction in this context is pretty much in a vacuum. I mean, of course, it's in a vacuum. And if it was considering anything in day-to-day, there are some specific mentions to the card pool back in 4th edition or something.
Yeah.
But it all still translates. It all still translates.
Yeah. So what were you saying about the legacy power level thing to do? What did that entail? Because I'm not sure the exact part that I was looking for that.
Yeah, it doesn't specifically say legacy power level thing to do, but it isolates specifically when you're building your deck, that your deck has a certain goal in mind. And so when they're talking about aggro decks in particular, they're I mean, in one of the lines they say, if an aggro deck is typically constructed to win in the first 10 rounds, which I assume they mean 10 turns, which is laughable by today's standards.
Yes.
But the idea of that line in particular, as I was translating it to how we would view it through today's lens, is what is your deck optimized to do in the first 2 to 3 turns, 4 turns. So knowing going in when in your deck construction that if you're in my role and you're playing a ponder brainstorm style cantrip control deck, that what are those cantrips likely suited to be doing in the early turns? If you're not doing that, if you're playing something a la combo, I want to sack my Hex Mage to create a Dark Depths on turn 2. The deck is optimized to, on turn 2, sack a Hex Mage to make a Dark Depths. And that goes with any of the decks that you might construct. But knowing going in that when you are first coming up with a brew, that you should be able to log line effectively what your deck does. So in Zach, you're the 8-cast guy. I mean, the one thing that's fun too is in thinking about 8-cast in my mind, it's 8-cast turn 1. I want to either play Urza Saga or establish an Emery, right? And if I'm not doing one of those two things, I feel like I would ship the hand. But now that you're in the space of also patchwork automatoning, that I don't know how that differs in your deck building. If you would say, well, now I'm interested in 3 potential opening lines, which would keep a variety of different hands in the depths of different hands, and that changes how you would navigate the rest of the game. But knowing that in all of those lines, so now you have 2 lines that are aggressive lines and 1 line that is fairly controlling line, and being able to consider opening hands in those different varieties and then go, this is what my deck does. And then depending on a certain matchup, you can go, this is what my deck wants to do. And that is all contained in the very early games of Magic as well, in terms of high-end deck construction.
Yeah. I think one of the first things we want to do is talk about, they have this outline here, and we'll post the outline up over here so you can look at it. But this is, the whole chapter is basically just like going over this outline, basically the checklist of like building a deck and deciding how to navigate that, and you know, which to me was amazing when I read this book when I was like 16. I was like, great, now I have, you know, I didn't even have a lot of cards, but I had a sort of roadmap to figure out what I was going to be doing as far as like evaluating cards and building a deck from that. In fact, one of the things that I think that we as older Magic players that have sort of an disposable income take for granted is the fact that as a 16-year-old, I got $10 every 2 weeks to like buy Magic cards, and of course I spent all 10 of that dollars on like Fallen Empires packs, you know, like
Sure.
or you know, what have you. And I had to find creative ways to solve problems that I couldn't do with you know, with money. You know, I'd have to be like, okay, well, you know, other people have Earnum Djinns or they have doppelgangers and stuff. Like, how do I compete with that at my local meta? And we weren't even playing tournaments. We were just like playing pickup games on Sunday at the local comic shop. So like, you know, a lot less was at stake, but at the same time, a lot more thinking was involved on my end as a kid than it is now as an adult, because like the deck lists are there. Like, you know, like you can, like there's a funny part in this where they're talking about like rebuilding a mana base and building a mana base and like figuring out everything. And part of that is very important now, but there's a lot less brewing that happens on the granular level because so much is built out for us over the last 30 years, you know? So I think one of the things that to me that like I realized like as a player, I had to build cheap decks, right? So I had a deck that was really good during the like Weatherlight Tempest era. That was Cloud Spirits, Thalicos Scouts, like Merfolk Looters, basically like low drop shadow creatures and flyers that weren't very effective blockers. And then I would boomerang my opponent's stuff and counterspell where I could. I basically built a tempo deck well before tempo was really a thing. And I had ways to like, okay, you're going to target my Thalicos Scout. I'll pitch a card basically to counter it, to return it to my hand and cast it again, right? So it's funny that what this brought to me as a Magic player when my resources were as limited as they were.
Yeah, and back then there also wasn't just all of the information available to you as well. So even if you had the money,
and not the internet, right?
Even if you did have the coin to get whatever cards you want, you may not necessarily have known what cards or how many copies of those cards to get in order to maximize,
or that they existed, or how to get them, because you know, like TCG Player didn't exist. You had to go to a shop and trade, and if the local didn't have the cards you needed, like eBay was a coin flip back in the day. Like you didn't know, like eBay was like, and eBay didn't even really become a source for getting Magic cards until like I want to say like 98, 99, and we were still very wary of it at the time.
And there just wasn't the straight up data horse that Moto provides as well. So you know, I think when you were talking about how the you said something about brewing doesn't happen, or the development doesn't happen as fluidly as it did back then, you know what I'm saying? Like, you had mentioned before about
the pure focus of the game. Like, you know, we didn't have deck lists. You know, this book had deck lists. That was it. You know,
it was much more slow moving, and I think that a lot of the times now, rather than a brand new archetype popping up, it's adaptations of archetypes. So, for example, like when new cards come in, like we've been talking about recently, about how 8cast has sort of adopted Patchwork Automaton as a way to like add a different angle, and so they've dropped the number of size and number of Kappa Cannoneers in order to have a more aggressive early slant. And that also helps pressure the fact that Bowmaster is a house in the format now. And then similarly, we've seen the more 4-color decks adopting the Halfling Legendary package and are moving away from stuff like Narset and stuff like Endurance, because it doesn't the Endurances don't necessarily work with the Halflings, and there isn't as much graveyard centric focused archetypes like there used to be. I mean, Reanimator is still a thing, but there isn't like Hogak in the format as much anymore, which, you know, come to think of it, maybe Hogak is prime for a comeback. But the aspects of deck building now are more so, I feel like, evolutions of archetypes as opposed to brand new archetypes coming in and shocking the world.
Yeah.
Gone are the days of Kai Bud being able
I
to
mean,
illusions donate to
the last time that
somebody
happened
playing
in
Grizzly Bears.
Legacy was 8 cast. I think like the last time we were really truly surprised by a brand new build of a deck, was 8 cast, which wasn't that long ago. That was like 2 years ago.
And that was
But it
also
doesn't
because
happen constantly.
it doesn't happen constantly. And that was also because Modern Horizons just like overhauled a bunch of the world, and nobody thought that. I mean, when it was first spoiled, everybody knew that like Urza Saga looked powerful, but nobody really quite understood how powerful. I think that like yeah, that's a particular scenario where it's not often that the pillars of the format just shift. And
Yeah.
then, before Ancient Tomb was a pillar, but not in the same way that Urza Saga has become a pillar
Yeah. Well,
all on its own,
I think also, I don't want to go too deep into the weeds for 8 cast, but I think it was the first time that we saw getting double value out of a saga. Like the concept that like this saga taps to do an effect, and then getting that value out of it twice. We just didn't. There was no metric for that. There's no heuristic for that. So I don't think we really realized until people started realizing, right?
There's that, and
But
then there's also like we didn't have the heuristic yet of what the Urza Saga package looks like.
Yeah.
Like that's something that when talking about deck construction in the book that where they talk about like essentially what your deck does and like what it wants to do, what its access for like adjustments are to be made. Whereas like nowadays also we look at cards and we think of them as packages, right? We like when you're playing Urza Saga, you're thinking okay, there's also a slew of 4 to 7 1-drops that are considerable as main deck tutor targets for your Urza Saga.
It's interesting that you brought that up because when we think of those packages, we also think of packages that we immediately remove from deck construction as well, right? If we're playing Urza Saga, we're probably not playing Brainstorm, Ponder, Days, etc. So those cards move away because we're trying to do a completely different thing, maybe in the same colors, but like we generally take those packages away. And so that's an interesting way to think about deck construction as a series of packages that are like ready to go. Like I'm not going to play. I want to turn one an Urza Saga so I can turn to a construct, right? That means that I'm probably not going to play a Delver of Secrets in my deck, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. And because of I'm playing colorless and I'm playing like that moves me into Ancient Tomb. That means I'm probably playing Chalice. So there go all of the 1-drop cantrips and stuff like that. So it's an interesting way to think about that, actually.
And it's typical because, like, I mean, what you just mentioned, how those things bleed together, right? So if you have if Ancient Tomb is in your deck and you're not combo, it is presumed that the Ancient Tomb is paired with a Chalice of the Void, because for so long, Ancient Tomb Chalice was just a pillar of the format.
Yeah.
Now that has like sort of skewed more, I think, towards if somebody says Ancient Tomb, in my head, they're much more likely to be on Urza Saga. And usually it's going to be a combination of both. But like in my mind, Urza Saga is going to be the first and foremost thing that pairs along with it because of the power level and the fact that it can also be put in a bunch of combo decks that don't necessarily play Chalice like Painter and things like that, where Urza Saga is still really powerful. There's also some control decks that play Urza Saga without Ancient Tomb, though it is, if I were to say, hey, I'm going to play a blue Urza Saga deck that's not combo, I'm going to play Jeskai Urza Saga, you can also deduce from that, likely, that it means that my Urza Sagas are not going to be as powerful as the 8-cast players' Urza Sagas.
Yes.
So it's like, you just know offhand from that context that my sagas are likely going to be 3/3s, maybe 4/4s, as opposed to 8/8s and 9/9s.
Yeah.
And then therefore the way that those games then naturally play out are also different. And that is also, there's information to be gleaned from that, off of very little information. And then the types of cards, like if I say I'm playing Jeskai Urza Saga, or if I play a saga deck, and you also see that I'm playing Brainstorm, you're like, okay, well, you can also probably deduce that in my package of Urza Saga targets, I will have the stuff that's more interactive. I'm going to have the Soul Guide Lantern in the main. I'm going to have a Pithing Needle in the main. I'm going to have these things that would be answers for stuff that otherwise I wouldn't have access to. Where on something that you might do with Urza Saga, you might be like, I just want the Aether Spellbound as a removal spell. I just want the Shadow Spear as a way to get through, and that's it. And then any other targets that I have are going to be in the board. Otherwise, like if I want to grind, maybe I have the Retrofitted Foundry in the board as well. Stuff like that. But like, it's like you can also adjust the package accordingly. Similar to like Stoneforge Mystic. If I'm playing a controlling Stoneforge Mystic deck, maybe I'm going to lean harder on a Batterskull or a Jite, as opposed to like D&T that might want to just keep the aggression going and search up the Cauldron immediately. And so if I see my opponent go turn 1 Vial and then they put in If I see turn 1 Vial, I'm way more likely to think that Cauldra is going to be in my future as opposed to Batterskull.
Yeah,
et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean?
yeah. So let's get into the Roman numeral Roman numeral 1, devising a driving idea for your deck, right? Like, so the first thing they say is this concept has a great deal to do with the philosophy of deck construction you wish to employ, something we talk about here all the time. And then they fall into the 3 categories: the aggressive category, the reactive category, and the denial category. And you know, I've done a lot of highlighting, but we don't have to really go too far into that to realize that there are you know, those categories exist in Legacy, of course. And then I think the important part of the Roman numeral I, the Roman numeral 1 section is the last line of the last paragraph here is that it is not uncommon for these philosophies to be intermingled. Most decks function as a mixture to two of the 3. In some cases, if you're Delver, Delver is actually all 3 of those. It's a fast creature deck with denial, and it is reactive, right? Like, so it's funny how these concepts actually do sort of translate over 30 years after the fact, you know?
Now, and also, I think that if you aren't at least some combination of those, even in today's standards, right? Like, if you are not some combination of those, what those combinations mean in my mind in modern day terms is it means, can your deck pivot? Can you choose to be the beatdown if you want to, or can you play the controlling role if you need to, et cetera, et cetera? So, like, in the world of people who are like me, who are, you know, Tundra control mages for life, if you know, I fall into the trap a lot where I'm like, I just want to, you know, fucking play, you know, Gaia's Blessing control, where I just go infinite and never die, right? But at the cost of that, it means that if I don't have access to pivot to, like, start turning the corner and get aggressive on my opponent, and my opponent knows that, then there's a lot of luxury for them to be gained of, like, okay, I can either slow roll my play, or I can take advantage of the fact that my opponent's going to give me a lot of time because I know that they don't have the access to pivot. Whereas, like, Delver being a top deck for so long is because it's adaptable. You know, it can play the control role when it needs to. It can board in and be a fast aggressive deck when it needs to. And in the interim, where it can do that mid game if it needs to. And the same thing with with Acast. Similarly, like, a lot of the top decks prove that they can play multiple roles. You can just stick a Chalice and then use all of your resources to protect that Chalice to blank a bunch of your opponent's cards and stay ahead of them before you decide to beat them down. Or you can just play a fast Saga, beat them down really quickly, and never let them deploy all of their resources. So the decks that have access of being able to do all of those things is really important in today's standards. Similar, like, if you have combo control decks, you know, it's like they can play the control role, but incidentally, they can also combo you out. Think of things like Breakfast, right? Like, Breakfast has an Urza Saga package. They can play a beatdown role if they need to, but also they have the auto I win button naturally baked in, and you have to, your behavior when you're playing against those decks has to respect those opportunities that those decks present. You know what I mean?
I think one of the interesting parts of all of this stuff is when we get into the second type of strategy, and they talk about the idea of versatility and the reactionary deck. And the fact that it says, like, for both this and the resource denial deck, is that and this philosophy, like the reaction philosophy, is typically relying upon a secondary theme to achieve victory, right? You don't play miracles because like, entreat the angels is what you're trying to do as a deck. Like, it's, the deck is called miracles, but you're not like, boom, I'm just trying to get out and treat the angels as fast as possible, right? Your deck is a reactive deck that as miracles, right? That the real miracle card in your deck is obviously Terminus, and then you have St. Catherine, you have Entreat the Angels, right? But those are really secondary to what you set out to do initially, which is stop your opponent from being able to maximize against you and then stabilize. Once you've done that, then you're going to be doing your secondary strategy, which is, oh, look at all the angels I have.
Yeah, I think that part of that, and this is a good example of, like, when Triumph of St. Catherine was spoiled. Everybody was like, how good is this? Like, it may be good, it may not be good. Everybody knew that, like, okay, yeah, if you miracle for 2, it's a 5/5 lifelinker. Obviously, that's a good rate, right? But I knew immediately out the gate, I was like, this will be a game changer, right? Now, it's still a 5/5 vanilla creature if the lifelink doesn't matter, right? So it's not like overhauling the world or anything. But what the card does do is it allowed you to in your control deck take a proactive slant, which let you do what we were just talking about of being able to go aggressive on your opponent when you need to.
Yeah.
And that opens up a whole paradigm of the game that was effectively not really available to a control deck like Miracles before, outside of something like Monastery Mentor. So
Well,
in my head, when you were like, yeah, the thing that you're trying to do is Terminus, nowadays, when even though you're playing reactive, there's a proactivity to being reactive in my head, which is why I have such a hard time ever getting away from counterbalance. Because in my mind, the way that I navigate a counterbalance deck is it is my way to proactively establish some kind of control on the table that my opponent then has to behave around, which, you know, similar to Terminus, like they have to think if they know that I have Terminus, they can't just, you know, swarm the board and then assume that is going to be good enough, because I'm going to clean them up. So they have to respect something that I have available to me, which in the same way that I think of proactively, it's like they have to respect Terminus, but if they don't, I can proactively slam a counterbalance, which is usually why those things feel like they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Because naturally, when you're playing those out, you as the pilot get to be proactive regardless of what your opponent's doing.
Yeah.
You know?
So I think that leads us in really well to the second Roman numeral, Roman numeral 2, II, as it were. Specify other cards that work well with this idea, which, like Geist of St. Catherine, is a perfect example of cards that you looked at and were like, this works well with what I'm trying to do. It keeps me alive. It also kills my opponent. And like, it, you know, it can even be a removal spell in a pinch if you're miracling it off of a brainstorm or something like that. But I think the real sentence that I think drives this whole point home is analyze what will be some obvious difficulties and how to overcome them. And that is what, I mean, that's basically like a pinpoint of what Geist of St. Catherine does for your deck.
I think that there's that particular section, it's fairly broad. And in the context of something like Triumph, what that really enlightened or really helped me specify as to like what they're talking about and how to apply it to like modern day stuff is in regards to Triumph of St. Catherine, compared to something like Terminus. Obviously, Brainstorm is the best way to enable a miracle, right? Because it's an instant speed card draw that you otherwise already want in your deck. And being able to Terminus at instant speed is fantastic. Obviously, that, you know, one of the strengths of Sensei's Divining Tap when it was around. But similarly now with Triumph of St. Catherine, one of the biggest aspects of optimizing that card is being able to catch somebody in combat, miracling it in combat, and then being able to block. That is something that you didn't need for Terminus. Sometimes you would get it off with Entreat, but it's a little bit less so. Entreat usually was overwhelming an opponent, whereas Triumph is unlikely to overwhelm an opponent. But if you can get them in the position where you can miracle at instant speed, so in the line that where you said, you know, analyzing what cards go well with it, in all of the testing that I've done with Triumph, I have found that Triumph makes all of the instant speed cantrips that otherwise aren't good enough to see play, opt, consider, anything at instant speed, any literal instant speed cantrip is elevated so much more because of the access to Triumph of St. Catherine that if your opponent, if you cast, let's say you attack me, right? You're attacking me with a construct, with, you know, whatever your construct is, and I just play opt, right? And you have any thought that I may know the top of my deck, or like this is a weird time to cast opt, like you may have to think a lot harder about this otherwise really low powered card and fighting over it, or knowing that a fight is about to happen, and you go, okay, well, I have Force of Negation in my hand. Do I need to like tap out right now and fight over this? Because I'm not going to be able to fight over Triumph. Like, this feels weird to be fighting over this kind of cantrip, but I have to respect it more.
Especially if I'm attacking with a 4/4, you know, like then I just get blown out, you know?
Like context is everything, of course, but like the idea of like, you know, analyzing which cards would go better. Like, I have played a bunch of opt and consider before as like, you know, just testing for a more instant speed version of Miracles. But like, Triumph really changes that paradigm because of how much more powerful it is in combat. And this one section of like, this section really reminded me of ABC deck building in a lot of ways.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's like, of course, everybody understands, like, you always are looking for, you're looking for synergies, like, of course, but focusing on this thing really highlighted for me now is like, not only is an ABC deck building, you're going, yes, this works with this, of course, you know, this, therefore this, but also more so is what is the most powerful play pattern that your A is involved in? And then how can you maximize specifically that play pattern to find out what the strength of your B and C are? Yeah. So Triumph is great if you miracle it, right? Of course. But it's really, really good if you can miracle it in combat and trade and catch the creature on the block and then untap and attack again. Like, that's really where your swings come in. And so in that regard, Ponder or Portent isn't like Portent, you can get the miracle on your opponent's turn, but you're not going to catch them in combat because you have to catch it in their upkeep.
Yeah.
Where it's like if you can somehow set it up your miracle and then do it in mid combat where you're really going to catch them, that really is where the power level of something like Triumph is.
That can that can basically be a 20-point life swing. That's the damage you didn't take and the life you gained, then untapping and then gaining 5 and dealing 5. That's like in a great scenario, that's a 20-point life swing off of two magic cards technically because you had used the draw spell, but still,
it's also the implied value, right? The implied value is like, okay, something like an opt or consider or any other instant speed cantrip. I've even tried things like illusion of choice, which is just literally is an instant speed 1 mana spell that says you get you choose how your opponent votes or something like that. Or and I remember thinking like, okay, maybe I'll like incidentally try and pair this with like a Council's Judgment. So Council's Judgment on 4 mana can turn into like can vindicate 2 things as a way to test like, okay, well first I want to try instant speed cantrips because I want it for Triumph, but then therefore if that's going to be what I'm going to do, then I also want Council's Judgment, which I wouldn't have gotten to otherwise. But the idea is like, okay, well, your 1 mana cantrip that may or may not level up this other spell that isn't very good is pretty underwhelming. However, the perceived advantage that it's also generating is, well, if this miracles my Triumph in combat, then it's also like a removal spell. So it's an enabler that's also theoretically turning into a removal spell. And if I look at this cantrip through the lens of, okay, this draws me a card and removes a creature, then it's really good, right? Now, of course, there's setup involved in that. But if you're thinking, like, what is the ideal scenario that I can set up? What's my deck maximized to do? And if it's maximized to 1 mana cantrip, remove your creature, gain X life, that's actually really solid, right? Like, it's way more attractive than a 1 mana cantrip that doesn't do anything.
Yeah. Well, I think we drove that point home. Hey, while we have everybody's attention, if you're enjoying this series, the podcast itself, comment, subscribe, like, all that stuff. That always helps. Now, let's move on to Roman numeral 3. That is record the deck. And I want to real quick give a shout out to Moxfield. There's a quick Moxfield ad coming up. Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned. And like I said, so, recording your deck, like we already do that all the time on Moxfield, but I think that at this time, no one was really, writing down their deck and making notes and changes and stuff. So it was a really important piece of the puzzle. And I don't want to harp too far on it because there's another similar part coming up. So I just wanted to we do that. Like I said, we do that with Moxfield, and it allows us to basically make changes and stuff like that in a way that's kind of relevant. So let's move on to. I just
want to point out on that particular topic, because it was sort of serendipitous that we were going to be covering this chapter, and then and how it came to fruition. I mean, of course, like this is something that's ongoing in usually the communities for certain archetypes, but friend of the pod, Marcus, who's a good an excellent European player. He's known for like high tiding a bunch of various Jeskai control decks and blue-white X decks, and routinely in the Miracles chat and in chats with just him and I, where we'll talk about different deck ideas. We'll send each other deck lists. We'll talk about what are our problems, what are we trying to solve, what are different areas that we're trying to figure out. And when we record the deck list, and part of figuring out those things out is using your community and the resources that you have at hand to help you solve the problems with a deck list that you may otherwise not fully understand, even if solutions are seemingly obvious, right? Yeah. So an example was he sent me a deck list that is a Blue-White X Urza Saga deck, and he had a particular problem where he was like, I'm looking for, this sort of thing to help stabilize. And he was playing Urza Saga, but he didn't have Shadow Spear in the main. And I said, well, I think you can condense some number of your slots by having access to Shadow Spear to turn on your constructs to help stabilize a board. And then that would give you, something else. And then, but we were talking about it not as the way that 8cast would talk about it, which is I want to be able to push damage or, steal games from Delver. It was a different context that we were looking at the lens of Shadow Spear in. But if you were to look at a deck list and didn't know the play pattern is different here of how we want to optimize the Shadow Spear for the goal, versus seeing Urza Saga plus Shadow Spear in every other deck list you ever see, you may not recognize that it's like, no, the idea of the Shadow Spear in this deck is for these solutions. And so when you're looking to solve that problem in game, you go, oh, this is what this is in the deck for, as opposed to if you were to play in a different context, it's in a different context. So like being able to record your deck list, isolate why every part of your deck is there, like what's the purpose of every card, and then being able to discuss that with your community of people who are helping you out, that's where recording your deck list is really helpful, because then you can actually like list out, these cards are for this, these cards are for this card is specifically for this card is specific for this in the ideal scenario. And then if something is missing or something is stunted or something's not working, then you go, okay, well then we can switch up numbers because it's not solving the role that it needs to solve.
You know, not to point out that we live in like a golden age of Magic the Gathering content where like you can consume just so much Magic the Gathering content. And like I said, when I was in high school, it was this. I had this and Duelist and Inquest and Scry, and that was kind of it. The idea that the internet exists in such a way now where like I could spend the entire day talking to my friends about Magic and I having to call them on the phone or like wait until study hall, like we can discuss Magic constantly. And it was something that as a 15, 16-year-old, like I had to call up my friend Paul and we would play games of Magic with each other on the phone. No webcam or anything like that. We would just explain our board state constantly to each other. And this is like, at a time when like, if somebody else was trying to call my house, the busy signal would happen. We would spend hours talking about Magic cards. And now we do that all on the internet, all through Discord. Join our Discord, obviously. The link's below for that. But like, think about that. Like, it's just wild how much more, how much the internet has like just exacerbated the amount of Magic content that we can get a hold of.
Dude, you're making me think. I recently saw. I mean, it keeps going back to the episode where we were talking about how like learning from chess and applying it to Magic and vice versa, and how to analyze things. And I was watching. I saw a video of Magnus Carlsen, #1 chess player in the world, and essentially he was playing a game of mental chess. Right? They didn't have a board in front of them. They were just playing a game,
yelling out,
saying moves to each other and talking through the moves in a similar way where you might explain a board state and then be like, I was thinking about this, I was thinking about that, and we understand what you're talking about. But like literally his opponent was like, yeah, well, what do you think about something like in this position you go HG3 King H3, which is just a move on the board, and then Magnus goes, yeah, but what's your idea? Okay, knight G6. Then what do you do? And they don't have a board in front of them. They're just talking through.
And I could never. I couldn't. I eventually, if I learned how to play chess better, I could. I suppose do that. But it's wild to the layman watching like how fluidly that all happens.
But that's at the same time that's something that we do in Magic, right? Yeah. Like you can explain. You can just go, yeah. So I'm going Saga 1, Ancient Tomb on 2 because I want to be able to pump out 2 sagas and then get this. And then get a Shadow Spear. But if I do that, then if I play a land, if it's not a soul land, then I can't actually equip it that same turn, which means that I'm exposing my Shadow Spear up to a prismatic ending on the following turn, and then I may not actually be converting the life gain that I want to offset my Urza. It's like to offset the Ancient Tomb life loss because I know the game. It's like we can talk through all those patterns without actually having this stuff in front of us and know what we're talking about, and then go, yeah. So actually, you shouldn't get the Shadow Spear first in this matchup. You should get whatever, because you're going to be able to maximize your mana faster. But like if you do Urza Saga on turn 2, then that opens up a whole bunch of extra lines that will convert an additional 4 damage, and that 4 damage means something because if they go it's like all of this comes to fruition without really much. We just know the play patterns.
We just
of those
know.
things.
Yeah.
But like in that position where you're going, okay, if I go Urza Saga on 1 in the dark, like ideally I want to get an action spell, and that action spell is going to be what? Well, if you get Shadow Spear and you're not in combat and you're not going to be able to leverage the equip, then maybe that's not the best option, and I want an additional proactive spell to get that will maximize my mana a little bit better, whatever that I don't know what that would look like, but you know what I'm talking about. And then we can get in those positions where you're like, I really find that like I get a Mox Opal more often than not, but then it's not often that I need the additional mana source because I'm on a more aggressive slant and I notice that I'm wasting mana every turn, and it could be optimized a little bit better, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, what does that slot look like? Is it, and then when we look at new spoilers, we're like, does that mean that you want Candy Trail? Like, is Candy Trail as a one of actually really good? Because then you can get it, you get the ETB value, set up your draw step for the next turn, and then like, that's actually the most optimal play? Like, who knows? But that's sort of where you get from understanding those play patterns of what your deck's trying to do early. And that's what this chapter sort of encapsulates.
Phil, indulge me for a moment while I partake in an anecdote.
Yep.
So at the dog park, I take Brandon to the dog park all the time, and there's another dude there that plays Magic. And so occasionally he and I will just like get into like the zone, BSing about Magic. And he plays like draft and commander and stuff. So like we don't really get too far in the weeds about Legacy, but a really great story that kind of helps people kind of understand like how wild it is that we can just talk about this stuff, off the cuff. Was I went in one day and I saw this woman that I know, and my buddy was there on the side, and I like waved hi to him. But some other woman was yelling at her because her dog was like being aggressive or whatever. And she just left the dog park. And basically what it came down to was like her dog was telling that dog to like, please leave me the F alone. I'm playing with my toy and I don't want to deal with this other dog. It all came down to this. There was one really aggressive lady in the dog park just being mean to people. Saturday dog park people, if you have a dog, you know what I mean. Like, come on. But so this woman is just like, and it's like her husband, and her friend. Like, you bring 3 people to the dog park to watch your one dog. Like, what are you doing? Anyhow, this woman, I walk in and I'm immediately fed up. I'm the kind of person that like I'm gonna say something if you're being a jerk, especially in the dog park where like living beings exist and need to be, like some policing needs to be done. So after this woman she left, when I walked over to this lady, I was like, hey, as a heads up, like you're in the wrong here. I hope you know that. Like, her dog was being clearly vocal to your dog about what boundaries to set, and you didn't help that situation out by removing your dog from the situation. That's all you had to do. Your dog's trying to get a toy from this other dog, and like, whatever. Like, and she was like, well, that's just your opinion. And I was like, hey, you know what? And I'm sharing it with you, like, and I could see like her husband and her friend were just like, she does this all the time, and I say all that to say this. I removed myself from the situation after that. I said my piece, and my wife is like watching a loaf of bread that we had just bought. And I go over to talk with my buddy who I play Magic with, right? And we're chit-chatting, and I think this is about right before Ragavan got banned in Legacy. So we're talking about that, and he's like, oh, Ragavan's so good. I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's going to get banned, blah, blah. But I could tell that this lady was listening in on the conversation. And she thought I was trying to ban her from the dog park, right? So she's like, she's like, well, I could hear, like her husband's like, come on, let's go. She's like, well, I'm not leaving until he leaves. And it's just funny, like the way people, like the layman hears what we say to each other. We're talking in a completely different language, right? So, like I said, allow me to partake in a bit of an anecdote to kind of set that straight. Is a little funny, a funny situation. But so now let's go on to the fourth pip, the fourth Roman numeral. Perform analysis, and this has a few different things. We've got A, B, what? Oh, just A, B, and C, right? A is calculate your mana distribution. B is calculate removal capability and importance of removal. And C is calculate effectiveness versus the 5 basic decks. Let's work backwards from that. First off, what they're telling you, again, I said this before, make a battle box, right? They're telling you make a battle box. Figure out what are the primary decks that you need to be playing against that you see as often as you do, and see if your brew pairs up against these decks well.
What do you consider the pillars of the format? That if you're going to go into Eternal Weekend in December, and you should know these decks are likely to show up in the room in sufficient numbers that you have to be prepared for them. And if you don't have a plan for those pillars, then you are likely going to either struggle against them or not know how to navigate that against them, and then that will cost you in a tournament where 2 losses means you're out of the, anything more than 2 losses means you're out of top 8, right? So it's like the room for error is very thin. So preparation means a lot, and a lot of what this section of perform analysis, by today's standards, they mean playtesting. But I think that the way that it sort of pulled back the curtain for me a little bit further was like, really think of yourself as a scientist. Even with something established, like, the science is never solved, right? Like the science is the best that we know right now. And we make informed decisions based off of the most recent and confirmed research that we have. But like that doesn't mean that anything is ever like locked in unless there's a position stand that shows something that is empirically true. But in Magic, nothing is empirically true, right? Like you never are like, I have the best 75. This is the actual empirically optimized 75 100%. Like, there's no way to be able to
even
actually.
if it's just the optimized 75 for you, it might not be the optimized 75 for your like against your opponent. You know, like there's so many factors to take. There's so many random factors to take into account on that.
It's all contextual, and so like the idea that you can be the idea of thinking yourself, okay, I put yourself in the role of the scientist, and your goal is to find the best 75 or the best 95 in terms of you 80 card sickos. That like you go in and same thing like when that conversation that I was having with Marcus over our chat, like you go in with a hypothesis, right? You're like, okay, here's you have a problem, and your hypothesis to solve that problem is these things, these cards in these numbers, and the theory is that, you know, if I add Shadow Spirits to the deck, I will improve my percentage against these specific aggro decks by these numbers, and then you test it. And in that testing, if you can't actually assign if you're not seeing the results of your hypothesis, if you're seeing something entirely different, that's going to inform your next hypothesis to then evolve your research, to evolve your playtesting. And I know that we've talked about that before, but like really look like examining it through the lens as like, you are a scientist with a hypothesis that's trying to experiment, and then your experiment will give you data that will then inform your future hypothesis to continue iterating on a deck list. Continuing your research, and your research is never done. Like you will do as much as you can getting up to Eternal Weekend for the most optimized 75 that you can based on the research that you did, knowing that afterwards you might have recognized, like, I have a whole new set of hypotheses based on this event that's going to inform my decisions going forward with the evolution of this deck. And the more minds that you have on it, the better optimized your deck is likely to be. There's so much data on Delver that you are more likely to have the better 75, the more optimized 75, than you are with your brew going at it by yourself, right? The same thing that, like, in the research world, if you're a scientist, if you're going at it alone on your own dime, that's going to take a lot longer than if you have all of the resources and minds all over the world sharing as much information as they can to improve and skip over a lot of stuff that you would have to struggle through on your own. So I want to in this way, go.
I want to piggyback off of that because I like I said, I like to go back to where my mind was at when I got this book and what I was dealing with as far as like these concepts, and what that concept meant to me is I had to with an Uno deck, because I didn't have proxies, I would build the other deck, right? And then I would play like as though I was a person who didn't know it was in the other person's hand against each other. Because when I went to Ohio every summer, which was like peak time to learn to play Magic, like you have off of school, I would go to Ohio and I wouldn't have access to any of my friends for like a month. So I would have to like be like, okay, like Confessions of a Necro deck player. I played like, Contagion era Necro. And I would build like, okay, now I'll play a blue control deck, but I would like build it with Uno cards and like write on the Uno cards in Sharpie like what this deck is, and then like under that I would have like what another card was that would be in another deck, and I'd literally just bash these into each other alone, or like, I was at my Aunt Stelly's house, so my Aunt Stelly, like my great aunt, so she was like in her late 90s, would just be staring at me thinking I was doing like witchcraft with like Magic cards and Uno cards together.
We are doing witchcraft.
Yeah, we are. But so what's wild is that, so you take that concept, there's a small amount of self-discipline that you have to achieve to not play favorites when you're doing that sort of testing. And so when I later on, I think I've told you about this, there was a book called Play Poker Like the Pros by Phil Hellmuth, where again, I traveled to another place where I didn't have a lot of friends, but I wanted to learn how to play poker. So what I did is there's this part of the book where they teach you about the animals of the game. You have the mouse, who only plays the top 10 hands, the elephant, who always sees the flop, the hyena, who plays weird stuff, and then you, right? And so I would create games of poker where I would have to evaluate blind against each of these things and see what they had. So like it's wild how effective the internet is in making it so that you can learn the game much more effectively and easy versus trying to play the game by yourself.
You just reminded me too of one thing when I was reading this chapter, when thinking through the aspects that we've talked about community, looking through building battle box, et cetera, that I think that there's a disservice that has been done over the long haul of the game's trajectory versus information availability in the olden days versus information availability now. And what I mean by that is we've all heard the stories of the person showing up to an event with their super secret tech and fucking crushing everybody, right? Like, oh my God, nobody saw this coming. How absolute genius. We've never seen it before. It's unbelievable. They took down the event, and it just immense genius. How could anybody think about this? And I think nowadays, I don't think something like that is reasonable for success.
It's much rarer.
And
it happens in more limited card pools. Like you can do it in standard, you know.
I think that like the world now, so much of your deck preparation is also preparation of understanding what the metagame looks like at the time.
Yeah.
And so the idea of if you go into a big event and part of your preparation for that event, if you expect, a certain metagame, is you are not only aware of like what the metagame is going to look like, or you have a hold on what the metagame is going to look like, but you also have an idea of what that metagame looks like and what their preparation is against something like you. So if you are a Reanimator player and you're going into an event and you're thinking to yourself, okay, I expect Painter to show up in some number. I expect, ACAS to show up in some number, Jeskai Control in some number. Knowing what the most updated version, the most likely version of cards that they have in their sideboard to combat your strategy is going to navigate how you determine what cards you're selecting and then how to navigate your game. If you think you're going to run into you think Mono Black Helm is going to show up and you need to be prepared for enchantments. And then you also need to be prepared for like Soul Guide Lantern and things of that ilk. And so you're like, okay, I need to not only be prepared for enchantments, but I also need to be prepared for artifacts. And as we mentioned before, like the downswing of endurance, like maybe I don't need to respect endurance as much, and therefore that might influence. Like so much of how you prepare now is informed by understanding the metagame at large, not in tournaments.
It's all slice of time,
It's slice of time, and like part of your preparation isn't just like what the metagame is going to look like at an event. It's also what the community collectively agrees upon at the time is the most optimized version of that thing. Similar in chess, it's like if the top players are going to go into the candidates tournament to determine who's going to play in the World Championship. Well, the players that are going to be at that tournament, right? Like it's an invitation only tournament. The players that are going to be there. Similar, if you go to EU at a certain time in a certain point in the Legacy format, you can more or less determine what decks are likeliest to show up. Delver will show up. Urza Saga decks will show up. Some amount of Storm will show up. Like if you parallel those ideas, somebody entering the candidates tournament is going to go, okay, I know these players all like to play this opening, and they're the most efficient in this opening. So not only do I need to know how they're going to advance with that opening, but I also need to know the best strategies to combat that opening if I'm playing both white, and how to defend if I'm playing as black. And if you go into Eternal Weekend or any other large event, you have to know what that metagame looks like, and then also what those openings are most optimized to do on both the play and the draw. You can't just go into an event thinking like, yeah, these are I know the format, I know what their sideboards look like. You do need to know those things, but then you also have to go. What's up?
The play and the draw didn't exist during this book. I just remembered that. you
well, there you go.
8 cards.
but like But so one of the things that's like really important is like in this thing where they're saying, collect data, like play test your stuff, is you have to have your plan both going in, knowing how you're supposed to compete both on the play and the draw. So it's a lot of prep work that goes in that may not get the same, time of day as like card selection. Maybe you have some amount of sideboard guiding on, okay, I'm on the play, I'm on the draw. But like, does that sideboard guide also include play patterns? How am I supposed to navigate with being on the play on the draw? It's like, do you know that the Delver community is in agreement that, you're supposed to board out Dazes on the draw against the deck that you're playing? Yeah. Because if you can go in knowing that, that's going to give you an edge.
You can slam cards on the turn you need to, Yeah.
But then also if you know that they're like, board out 2 Dazes, then you can go, okay, when you're in game, you're like, I can respect this half as much. Does that risk offset the reward of what I want to do this turn? And you can navigate it that way. But those are informed decisions because you did the homework,
you did the research,
prep time beforehand. Right? You gather data, right? Which is like what this chapter is all about.
So B is calculate removal capability and importance of removal. I don't want to harp on this for too long, but I have highlighted a couple lines here. The ability to remove opponent's cards is of varying importance in different decks. Many times, a deck is vulnerable to certain enchantments, thus it is important that you rid your opponent of them. And then the first thing you must look at is whether or not your deck needs removal, right? Some decks don't. And then finally, also weigh exactly how important the destruction of each problem card is. Removal capacity should be function of necessity and susceptibility. So that's interesting to me, because what it's saying there is not every deck needs to just run like, Swords of Plowshares and Lightning Bolt and Disenchant and, like all the cards that were out there at the time. Some decks just need Lightning Bolt and Incinerate to get the damage through. Some decks are just playing Crusade. They're not every single deck. The card they talk about here is Blood Moon. Not every single deck cares about Blood Moon, so maybe you don't have to put Disenchants in your deck to worry about Blood Moon. But I think it's important, the idea of like calculating your removal capacity.
There's also something, a good recent example of this is in the Bowmaster metagame, a card that's been getting a little bit more heat is Fire Ice. Now, I personally don't think that Fire Ice is the way to go, but I do know that like the conversation is about Fire Ice being a flexible spell, in that like being able to tap down a permanent to like maybe offset, like, you turn off somebody's Pyroblast for a turn and then you can sneak something through. Like, that's not dead. It can also just like blanket combat by tapping down their creature and drawing a card. So like, you gain some time that way. But then the fire side of things is you can clean up a Bowmaster in one spell.
Yeah.
Right. So like you maintain parity. Is like, rather than spending a Swords of Plowshares on one thing and then they still have the body left over, you're actually spending 2 for 2 and you're cleaning up 2 for 2. Now, I don't think that that's the optimal line, because I think Fire Ice is just an underpowered card by comparison. And when you're playing underpowered stuff to deal with like the thing that your opponent's doing, then you still have to rely on them to have made the action before you can make the action. So I personally don't think it's great. But it is in a vein of what you were just mentioning, that the book says, like, what kind of removal do you actually need? And in this regard, it's like, well, I need specifically something that can deal with Bowmasters that is still otherwise playable. And Fire Ice gets a nice nod at that, because it means that if you're playing against, something like Storm, that where the removal, your Source of Plowshares is otherwise going to be blank, that it's like, oh, well, no, I also have this ice that maybe can, mess up their combo turn if they're not expecting it. And so like there's some value to be gained there. It's the least dead. It's the least objectionable option, right? But in a similar vein, it's also why Prismatic Ending, got the nod right out the gate, when it's like figuring out what is the most valuable, what do I actually have to care about? Prismatic Ending, be able to hit everything except lands, was a big deal, right? Like, I want to be able to hit both my opponent's Dragon Rage Channeler and a different opponent's Carpet of Flowers.
Yeah.
And having a spell at 1 mana that can do both is really, that's a really valuable tool. But then as the format evolves, and it's like, oh, well, now there's way more Teferi Minsk One Ring in the format, and Prismatic Ending really sucks at that. Do I need to shift over and play more something closer to Lightning Bolt? And then, I have to now concede the fact that it doesn't hit the Carpet of Flowers the way I want it to, or it doesn't hit the big construct anymore. Like those are the trade-offs of analyzing. But that, again, that comes into, you have to know the format and what you're trying to accomplish. That all comes back to the prep work. It comes to collecting the data and recognizing I am more likely to sit down and face a large construct this percentage of the time. I'm more likely to face, Teferi and Minskenbu this percentage of the time, and let those data points really inform your decisions as to how you're going to build your deck and when you're choosing your removal slots.
Yeah. All right. So I don't want to spend too much time on the A. It's calculate mana distribution. A lot of this information is going to be irrelevant now because mana distribution is completely different now. But I did want to read the spots that I highlighted real fast. First, look at how many cards there are that require each type of mana, right? Mm-hmm. So, your pips, as it were. Then look how many colored mana of each. So look at how many colored mana of each of these cards cost to cast. So it's sort of the same thing, but it's saying like you have X blue cards, X red cards, and then you have X pips.
But days doesn't matter in that pip because it's free.
Exactly, stuff like that doesn't get factored in.
But then when you're looking at Uro, you have to look at Uro as a double green card.
Yeah. And then it says factor the importance of the cards of each color. So, if you're not going to cast a spell until the end of the game, then you don't need it in the early game, right? Like, you don't need that mana in the early game. Again, a lot of this isn't as relevant because fetch lands exist and you can figure it out from there. A 2, 3, 4, 5 color deck has a lot less problems than it used to.
You want to know one area where like that stuck out particularly to me in all of my testing forever?
Yeah.
Let's play a little game, Zach. What card do you think I hate more than most in the world?
Blood Moon.
Basic Planes.
Basic Planes. Yeah, Basic Planes. I can see that. Yeah.
I hate Basic Planes so goddamn much, Zach.
Yeah.
It puts
But
me
it is a
further away
necessity.
from.
Yeah.
It puts me away from my Mystic Sanctuary. It puts me further away from my counterbalance. It doesn't cast straight up counterspell. I hate Basic Planes so much. I do so much. So much of my life is spent trying to find ways to reasonably cut Basic Planes entirely from my deck.
Yeah.
I don't want it. But like what you just said about like, is the card that you want to cast, depending on the number of pits, not going to be cast into the late game? And I have played so many decks where usually you want at least a number of basics equal to whatever your pip count is, knowing that you can reliably cast all of your spells off basics.
Yeah.
If you have a double blue spell and a single black spell in your deck,
you need a swamp.
You are like, I want a swamp and I want 2 basic islands, right? So at the very minimum, I can play all of the spells that I need to play off of basics. So that like if I get ruined somehow, I can still play the game. And one thing that I've done consistently is every time I had double planes in my Miracles deck, I'm like, well, I need double planes because I want to be able to reliably cast Entreat the Angels.
Did you just draw it in your opener?
Back in the day, you also needed double planes for things like Council's Judgment. There was more reasons to have double planes in your deck.
Yes.
Whereas, like, once it was just Entreat because Prismatic Ending came in, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to go down to 1 planes because if we get to the late stage of the game, I will have 1 planes and then I can, fetch up a Tundra and then I'll have my double plane suite for the turn that I want to be able to cast Entreat. But I know that I'm exposing myself to potentially getting cut off of double white, which is really important because maybe you have island planes fetch and you're like, I really can't afford to get a Tundra against an onboard wasteland. So what am I supposed to do now? These things come up a lot, but I don't know where I was going with this other than that particular thing of like mana distribution and like, yes, for most deck, it doesn't come up that often, but it comes up a lot for me. And that really, that particular line resonated with me because I'm like,
color deck. Yeah.
I was like, this particular chapter is digging in on me hating basic planes, but really wanting to support Entreat the Angels.
So the other lines I highlighted here are a good way to determine how much of each to use is to make a proportion of card colors, then alter it for other factors. That is, if there is one color that requires more colored mana than the other colors, shift mana from the other colors to that one. So that's kind of what you were talking about there. And then mixed lands can make this process easier. Mixed lands.
Love mixed lands. Sure do love mixed lands.
But the Blood Moon card makes this dangerous. It is generally not a good idea to solely rely on mixed lands, which is what you were talking about. And you will generally have to work with your deck for some time to achieve the best mana distribution. So you're still doing it. What, 7 years later?
Well, that concept also goes back to the notion that we've talked about before, which is you never want to be in the middle on something. You either want to dodge it completely or overload it.
Yeah.
And so if you look at like 4 color decks now, I mean, most of them play a Life of Malone somewhere in their 60, or maybe a Life of Malone or 2 if they're playing Yorion, but they are just off of basics entirely because the idea is like, okay, we're just going to overload the wasteland as opposed to be somewhere in the middle. Because if you go, okay, I'm going to get island planes and then fetch up a duel, and then they can cut you off a color, as opposed to you being like, okay, I'm just going to go mono duels. I'm going to be softer to something like Blood Moon, but I'll be a little bit more insulated against Wasteland because Wasteland won't be able to cut me off entirely if I play only basics plus a duel. Every blue-white player that's listening to me has been in this scenario where they're like, I'm supposed to have a really clean mana base. Wasteland's not supposed to fuck with me. And then you fetch island, plains, Tundra, and they hit the Tundra, and then all of a sudden you're mana screwed, and you're like, I can't believe it. How is this happening? How is this reasonable? And it's because that particular scenario plays in the middle ground, as opposed to either I'm going to fully respect Wasteland and be pretty much entirely on basics, but then also have my mana distribution be reliable on that spread of basic lands, or I'm just going to completely disrespect it entirely and overload it. And that's what 4-color does, which is I'm going to respect it in the form of Life on the Loam, but otherwise, no basics.
Yeah. All right. So the final note on this on that part of the chapter, these questions. So basically asking a lot of questions about the effectiveness of the five decks in the battle box, and then it says these questions must not strictly come out in your benefit, but if the answers are all bad for one kind of deck, it's generally a good idea to analyze your deck more thoroughly. So that's interesting. It's obviously smart. But there are times when we're just like, you know what, I'm a dog to this deck, and that's fine. I'm just gonna like move on. Like if I lose to Grixis Delver, I'm just gonna hope that I dodge it for like enough, like for 8 out of the 10 matches I play, right? And maybe I'll get one in. Like you
Dude,
don't have to always be good against every deck.
I'm the Miracles player, bro. I'm never going to beat Cloudpost.
Yeah, exactly.
Never beating it. 0% against that deck forever. Yeah. Unless they give me a tool that I otherwise want to be able to beat that deck, I'm never going to beat that deck. And my plan against that deck going into,
because you can't back to the basics those decks either.
Right. And even then, back to basics is like, okay, that's like you're one out, but now they have Beseiju. Like, who even knows if that would be even reasonable anymore, right?
Yeah.
But like, if I go into a big event, if somebody was like, Phil, what's your plan against Cloudpost? Dodge.
Yeah.
Dodge.
Okay, so then we go to Roman numeral 5, identify weaknesses. So I've got highlighted here, almost all decks contain at least one of the 5 elements that are reflected in the 5 basic decks. And thus, you should be able to assess where your deck is weak by this point. Additionally, there are other things to consider. You should determine whether you need to be able to draw more cards, deal more damage, or develop more quickly. Finally, the worst thing that can happen, you should essentially look at your deck and decide the worst thing that can happen to it, and then look for a way to deal with that deficiency. I wrote in the margins here, don't obsess. You don't have to like make sure that like, I think it was more important back in the day to figure out the answers to these problems because deck construction was a little less defined. But I think now it's not as big a deal. Like if I lose to artifact hate, and when I'm playing an artifact deck, I can't obsess over that too much. Like I just have to nod that like, yes, Meltdown is bad for me, and I have ways to deal with Meltdown as far as counterspells are concerned. But if one gets resolved, that's game over for me. I just have to live with that and move on. I can't spend 15 cards on my sideboard trying to figure out how to get around Meltdown.
It's being okay of understanding what you're going to lose to, right? Like if you go into an event and you're playing 4-color, you're going to go, yeah, I'm going to be soft to Red Stompy playing Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon. If I'm not playing Lightning Bolt or something like that specifically to counteract Magus of the Moon, it's like, yeah, okay, like we are choosing to be soft to that particular thing that we hope we don't run in against.
Yeah,
that particular line of like recognizing something, and if you are weak in a particular area and then shoring it up. I mean, man, if that wasn't just a direct flashback for me to the episode where we were talking about how the entire format has sped up their development, and if you are not doing also something to speed through your development, you're just going to be on the back foot for the majority of the games that you play in this format, right?
Well, your deck's in what we like to call a rebuilding year at this point. Like we're figuring out what the next steps are for it.
But yeah, that particular thing where it was like, or do you need to develop faster? Was that the line that you like was mentioned like verbatim?
Yeah, it was or develop more quickly.
Or develop more quickly. Yeah. Like that is from what, 1990, whatever, 1996 or whatever.
And it clicked something in you,
It was relevant. Yeah. It was directly relevant to today's standards. Now I get that the context is different, but they were like, back then they're thinking, yeah, you need to be able to develop by like turn 4, turn 5, where it's like now it's like you need to be able to develop on turn 1, But like if you're not capable of doing that in a meaningful way, it's like, okay, how do you assess, right? Yeah. But like that's looking at the format at a macro level, right? Like what are all the decks doing accordingly to match up to either speed the format up or slow it down, And the prime examples now, it's like, okay, well, if everybody can put 18 power into play by attacking by turn 2, then you have to be able to develop faster, right? If Storm can kill you faster, you have to be able to develop faster. 4-color gets Delighted Halfling. Ancient Tomb gets to do it by itself. The lands decks have played Mox Diamond and Exploration forever, right? But like that in formats where that's not the case, back during Top Era Miracles, when you knew that you were going to run into Senses Divining Top Counterbalance and the games were going to go longer, development slowed, right? And you chose options that you knew you were going to be able to execute on a little bit better. Hence, a bunch of decks got to play Abrupt Decay, knowing that they may not be able to cast it on turn 2, and that's okay. Because you knew that the game is going to go long enough that you go, I can establish fighting over a counterbalance with an abrupt decay at some point in the game, and then that will usually be good enough. But that's the format is slower, whereas nowadays the format's way faster, and you have to be able to develop faster. And like this chapter hits it 30 years later.
Yep. All right, so on to number 6. Number 6, Roman numeral 6, is assemble a deck and play against the 5 basic decks. They kind of already mentioned that. It's weird to go over it again, but so the C was calculate effectiveness, and then 6 is actually do it. So we're not going to spend too much time on that, but I did want to read the parts that I highlighted. Very often it will be the case that your deck will behave in ways that you did not expect. I think that's a huge point to make. More often, it will simply lead to you finding more problems, which must be rectified in your design. And then the testing process is also an excellent time to discover the best ways to use your deck. So I think a lot of times, especially when you pick up a brand new deck, you don't really know it until you sit down and you play it against another deck, right? And I think that's what they're getting at here. For me, playing 8-cast the first couple of times, I was trying to play it like I was a Delver deck, being sort of reactionary. And then once I figured out, like, oh, this is what my priorities are for this deck, this is what I need to do, I was like, oh, this is a completely different style of deck, so I need to play it as such. And I think that's a good example of what they're talking about there.
Yeah, the recent example. I mean, I test a lot of cards that on paper look like absolute dog shit if you don't know what the idea behind the cards are. When your suggestion there just made me think of back when I was thinking, okay, I want a proactive 3-drop for counterbalance in one of my builds for Miracles. And a card that I was literally at this point in testing, I was throwing shit at the wall. I was like, I'm not embarrassed to try anything. I'll try anything that in theory is good, even if the power level is low, and I'll test it and see how it goes.
You're gonna talk about Dream Cash?
We'll see how I play. And I played Dream Cash, right? So I remember I played Dream Cash, and then I came back onto the episode, and I told you and Nate, I was like, yo, Dream Cash, I was like, this is a proactive way to get a card into my graveyard as a 3-drop for counterbalance and Mystic Sanctuary. I'm like, this is going to be it. This is the way to go. And yes, the card was underpowered, but going in, I was like, this is a proactive 3-drop. The reason that I played it was that it's a proactive 3-drop for counterbalance.
Well, now you can play that instant speed divination.
Well, you can play the instant speed, but speaking of like where they're like, you may learn different things than what you initially outset as like the idea behind a card or a strategy. What I learned from playing Dream Cash wasn't that like, oh, this was a proactive 3-drop and that was valuable. That came up way less often than what it did of taking pressure off of Brainstorm to set up my Miracles.
You wanted 8 Brainstorms instead of 4. Yeah.
Right, but the thing that when I went in, I was thinking this is a proactive 3-drop for counterbalance. But when I came out, I went, what I really want is a way to grease the wheels without putting so much pressure on my Brainstorms to both fix my hand and enable Miracles.
Yeah.
And that wasn't directly obvious to me, as I was focused on something different. And then I recognized that it solved a different problem that helped me in a bunch of matchups that I felt like I would have otherwise been really tight, uncomfortably tight against. And
that leads right up to the last highlight, is that this step in the design process is important for obtaining new ideas and discovering where your deck is weak in certain areas. Certain aspects of your deck which will only be able to be understood by playing.
I didn't understand the tension, the amount of pressure that was on my Brainstorms until I tried something that highlighted for me, oh, I'm doing this, and then I don't need to spoil my Brainstorm, and now I can use it as a way to convert a Miracle as opposed to setting up a Miracle. Like, that's really important for me to recognize, and I wouldn't have done it had I not gone through the trials and tribulations of trying this off-the-beaten thing card that's obviously underpowered in today's format, right? But, like, now I know going in, I'm like, that led me to a whole, down the rabbit hole. From Dream Cash, I was like, I moved over to Merchant Scroll, and then I tried Merchant Scroll because I was like, well, Merchant Scroll can just get Brainstorm, and then that's also 3 mana the way that Dream Cash was.
Yep.
That was also not great, but I never would have gotten to Merchant Scroll for Brainstorm and then a bunch of other things had I not gone through Dream Cash, and et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? Like, they nailed it 30 years ago.
Yeah. All right, on to number 7. Remove unnecessary cards and make appropriate modifications and enhancements. That's sort of obvious and part of the previous thing, but I think important to read the highlighted parts here. One important revision note during your process is the extraneous card, the card that you're like, I have too many of these in my hand. Cards sitting in your hand are also a sign that you have too many cards that perform the same function in your deck. There is a card that performs this same function, only more effectively. You got to ask yourself that question, right? Am I playing? So in your scenario, you wanted more brainstorms. So obviously, they were never sitting in your hand. But in a situation where, like, maybe you're trying to kill all the creatures on the board, and you have 4 Path to Exiles and 4 Swords to Plowshares, and you're like, that's too many. I'm always sitting here with like a Swords to Plowshares in my hand when I need to be killing my opponent. Those are the sort of areas that they're looking to talk to you about there.
Dude, like in my world currently, I feel like the correct number is like 2.4 dress downs.
Yeah.
I know I want more than 2, but I know I don't want 3. That's what I mean.
It's funny,
like
thinking about those scenarios now when they're like, what's the extra card in your deck? Because it's so hard to figure out what the extra card is. Because a card like Dress Down, let's say Dress Down's totally useless in this matchup. You can cycle it. You can play it and draw a card for it, right? And so you don't have the same metric of saying like, oh, this card's always just stuck in my hand, I need to get rid of it. But there might be a scenario where you've cycled your third Dress Down in a game, and you're like, I'm seeing this card and I don't ever find a use for it, but I'm just using it to draw like another card, So in that scenario, you're like, yeah, Council's Liberation would be better than this at the very least, that sort of stuff. So I think it's interesting that the way we have to look at the heuristics of how we decide that the card is extra in our deck now, aside from just being like it's stuck in my hand, because every card draws a card almost at this point.
Yeah, I mean, in that regard too, it's also a nod to how disciplined you can be in your card choices.
Yeah.
Because I mean, we've heard for the common idea for years and years and years is you're like, okay, well, in terms of opportunity cost, whatever, it pitches to Force Will.
Yeah.
And it's like that's not actually a reason to have a card in your deck, right? Like, it's like, oh yeah, you can just cycle it for 2 mana, but like you may not have 2 mana. Like 2 mana might be a lot.
Yeah.
2 mana might be something that you don't have the luxury to use, in a given time.
Yeah.
But like, being able to understand not only like, I think that that's part of where they were like, if a card is stuck in your hand, I think that like, if we were to extrapolate that 30 years later, I think what that also means is opportunity cost.
Yes, exactly.
And like minimizing the opportunity cost is done through things like, okay, well, you can cycle it. It cantrips. It pitches to Force of Will. Like there are other fail cases for it if it's not doing what it's in the deck to do. But like not every card can do that. And so like, in the instance where you're like, yeah, I keep finding that I'm sitting with a Swords to Plowshares in my hand. This is not what I need. Like this is bad. Now I'm relying on my cantrips or whatever to solve that problem. Whereas something like Dress Down, it's like, yes, I can cantrip for it, but like the opportunity cost of it being something else in your deck that is actually something you do want, as opposed to just the fail rate, is I think where we are in current day.
Yeah.
As opposed to back then, where it's like, yes, this card is sitting in my hand, that's a problem. But really, it's also I want to minimize the opportunity cost or in other words, I want to maximize every card in my deck.
Yeah. All right. So there are three more like parts. We really only one, because we're not going to talk about 8, which is assemble your sideboard, because we're going to go over that in chapter 10 when they talk about the sideboard. So let's go to 9, which is record your changes. Again, like I said, for Moxfield, we do this, and often what I put in the margins here is often. So it says record your deck and see modifications, then go back to the 4-step, recalculating your mana base. And I said, often we forget about this. Often we forget to recalculate our mana base when we remove a bunch of cards from our deck and add new cards, especially if they're different colors and have different mana costs and stuff, is to go back and reevaluate our mana base after we've made modifications. I think that all too often we forget to do that, because mana is all, again, so close to almost perfect so many times that you just assume that, like, yeah, it's still good. But I think that that's a really important step, is recalculating your mana distribution.
Shout out to the epicstorm.com. I think that the deck that I hear most about analyzing your mana base in conjunction with new card choices is Epic Storm. The combination of like, okay, yeah, we're playing this, therefore Underground Sea and Taiga are our 2 best lands. We want to pair those versus, pairing Badlands and Tropical Island. Like those are the best pairs. Like not only do you calibrate your mana distribution and how much of each kind of mana you should have, which then could influence your fetch land choice. But also thinking, okay, for the spells in my deck, what are the best kind of duels to pair with each other?
Yeah.
Like if you are
Brian is amazing
granted,
at that, by the way. He talks about that at the beginning, almost at the beginning of every single deck tech he does on the channel. Definitely check that out, because he'll be like, yeah, this is the time where, like, okay, we've changed the build of the deck. We're removing Galvanic Relay. We're adding in what's the card they just unbanned? Just forgot.
Mind's Desire.
We're adding in Mind's Desire, so that changes the mana base a little bit. And like that it is exactly what you're saying. He goes in and he's like, okay, Badlands is out, Taiga's in. Like, I think that's a really important and interesting thing that I honestly just glossed over when I watched the videos, but now, like, it makes a lot more sense.
And it's because the margins on Storm are really narrow, right?
Yes.
Like you can't fuck up because it'll be unforgiving. But like similarly, it's like if in Storm, it's like, okay, we're playing white instead of green because we want Prismatic Ending instead of Abrupt Decay out of the board. That changes how we're supposed to. That should change our fetch sequencing, because when we bring in Prismatic Ending, we want to ensure that our plateau is paired with our, with our Underground Sea, to ensure that, like, we have access to all of our colors, but then also can then split and pair whatever spell you're casting. Like, that type of thing is important to know, because if you know that you're bottlenecked into having to get the Underground Sea on turn 1, then you're like, okay, well, I know that Underground Sea should be paired optimally with Taiga. Is there a line that I can get to ensure that, like, that is how I lay out my mana so that I can convert my spells on time without wasting any of it?
Yeah.
And knowing that going in is you're right. It's like, it's very rare that, like, for the most part, fetch lands will solve that. Like, if you're playing Grixis Delver, it's usually like what 4-4-3-3.
We want to be. We want that, like, 0.7% to be in our favor, right? Like, so that's the thing that I think we need to that doing that stuff every time you can shave a point here or there, a point of variance away here or there. That's a point in your favor, right? And so over the course of a tournament, you draw an opening hand at least let's say you're playing a 10-round tournament at least 20 times, right? So if we think about that 0.7%, right? Every time we look at a hand, that's 5%. So one of those times, you're going to end up in a situation where you're like, God, if I had just put the right land in my deck, I would have been better off and I would have won that game. So I think it behooves us to think about those things and think about shaving those percentage points in our favor.
Dude, that's something that also just aside from tests, but also just actual ANT, or I guess what Storm, what the not exactly test version of Storm would look like now with Beseech coming out, and seeing the Storm community practicing with Vault of Whispers.
Yeah, I was going to say Vault of Whispers seemed like a card that would be smart in that deck, but it's funny that you mentioned it now.
But like the offset of Vault of Whispers was like, yes, it's something that you can convert off of your Beseech to bargain to, like, do what you want. Also exposes you to Wasteland, and having to figure out, like, are we in more in when you're collecting your data, you're like, are we in more positions where this Vault of Whispers is a liability or a payoff?
Yeah.
And if you're finding more often than not that you're like, man, the Vault of Whispers would be really nice, but we keep it ends up higher percentages of the time getting wasted than bargained. Yeah. Then you're like, okay, well, if we're not bargaining it more than it's getting wasted, then it shouldn't be in the deck, even if in theory it seems like it's really good.
Yeah.
And you got to go through the strides of, like, the theory is Vault of Whispers would be great to bargain, and we already want this. We're playing a basic swamp before. Maybe we can just change that and up the consistency of our Beseech. But then you're like, well, we're getting wasted 86% of the time. So, like, it's way worse actually, and shouldn't be in the deck.
So two final points for this section. A deck is never complete. I think that is a common factor with us anyhow. We always know that. And then additionally, each new set of cards. So this was Ice Age. So they were talking about, like, oh, maybe alliances will come out soon. Each new set of cards offers you possibilities for your deck that could lead to new changes, which I think is, especially for this era, it was probably even more prevalent then, because say what you will about power creep and whatever, and how the power creep was much lower then, but, like, every new set of cards was drastically more impactful to the game in 30 years ago than it is now. And then finally, step X, return to step 4. Step 4 was perform analysis. So, and you just keep doing that over and over again. That's the end of the chapter. But Phil, do you have anything to say about the deck is never complete?
I think the repeating going back and repeating from step 4 is the thing that keeps everybody involved in the game for as long as they do.
Yeah.
You know, I think more often than anything else, we go back to step 4.
Yeah.
You know,
perform analysis. Yeah.
We're
doing it
when
right
you're
now,
not
right?
when you're not in game, the thing you do more than anything else is return to step 4.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so that does it for chapter 2 of Deep Magic. This has been the Boomer Magic Book Club, and we will see you next week. Check out the playlist we have here for the chapter 1, and like, subscribe, all that stuff. Thanks so much.